Of all the rituals that defined medieval life, few were as revealing of the era's values, power structures, and attitudes toward the human body as the wedding night. We have inherited a softened version of it. Candlelight, rose petals, whispered promises behind a closed door. The reality was something altogether different. The medieval wedding night was not a private moment. It was a public event, a legal procedure, and for many of those at the center of it, an experience shaped more by duty, fear, and obligation than by anything resembling desire. To understand it honestly, we must follow it from the feast to the chamber and examine without flinching what medieval society believed, demanded, and witnessed on that night. The feast before. The wedding night did not begin in the bedchamber. It began hours earlier, at the wedding feast, a celebration whose length, extravagance, and intoxication level depended entirely on the wealth of the families involved. Among the nobility, feasts could last for hours, sometimes stretching across multiple days. Among peasant communities, the celebration was simpler but no less ritualized. Food shared communally, music played, ale consumed in quantities that left few guests fully sober by nightfall. Alcohol was central to the proceedings, and this was not incidental. The social lubrication of the feast served a deliberate function. It loosened the tension that surrounded what everyone present understood was coming. It gave the guests permission to make the ribald jokes, the bawdy songs, and the explicit commentary on the couple's imminent activities that medieval wedding culture considered entirely appropriate. For the bride in particular, who may have been as young as 12 or 13 in noble households, sitting through hours of increasingly explicit humor about her wedding night, delivered by relatives, neighbors, and strangers, was simply part of the ritual. No one asked how she felt about it. Specific foods and drinks were prepared and consumed with the wedding night explicitly in mind. Hippocras, a spiced wine blended with honey, ginger, cinnamon, and other warming spices, was considered an aphrodisiac and was frequently served to the couple. Dishes containing almonds, figs, and certain spiced meats were also believed to promote sexual vigor. For a groom who might be elderly, infirm, or simply anxious, these preparations were practical as much as ceremonial. Medical writers of the period were entirely serious about the aphrodisiac properties of certain foods, and the wedding feast menu was sometimes constructed with the specific goal of ensuring the groom could perform. The bedding ceremony. When the feast had reached its proper point, when enough food had been eaten, enough wine consumed, and enough songs sung, the wedding party rose. What followed was called the bedding ceremony, and it was among the most extraordinary rituals in medieval social life. The guests accompanied the couple to the bridal chamber. This was not a symbolic gesture. They went inside. They helped undress the bride and groom, a task that involved considerable handling, touching, and continued ribald commentary from all present. The bride's garters, removed during this process, were items of particular contest. Guests grabbed for them as good luck tokens, the scramble sometimes turning boisterous. The couple was placed into the marriage bed together, often still surrounded by guests who showed no inclination to leave. Why? Because consummation was not merely a personal milestone. It was a legal requirement. A marriage that had not been consummated could be annulled. The validity of the union, the legitimacy of future children, the transfer of property, the security of alliances, all rested on what happened in that bed. Medieval society could not afford to take consummation on faith. It needed witnesses, it needed certainty. And so witnesses stayed, watching, until they were satisfied that the couple had begun the act that would seal the contract. Among the highest levels of nobility and royalty, this process was sometimes even more formalized. The sheets of the marriage bed might be inspected afterward for evidence of the bride's virginity. The presence of blood taken as confirmation that she had been a virgin and that the marriage had been consummated. These sheets could be displayed publicly or presented to family representatives as proof. The bride's body was, in this moment, simultaneously the most intimate thing in the world and a document of public record. The blessing of the bed before witnesses finally withdrew and left the couple alone. It was common practice in medieval Europe for a priest to be present at some point during the bedding ceremony to bless the marriage bed. This blessing was taken seriously. The priest would sprinkle the bed with holy water, recite prayers for fertility and godly union, and formally invoke divine blessing on what was about to take place. The juxtaposition is striking to modern eyes. A priest standing in a bedroom while wedding guests made explicit jokes, blessing a bed in which two people, possibly strangers to each other, were about to fulfill a legal and ecclesiastical obligation. But to the medieval mind, there was no contradiction here. Sex within marriage was not sinful. It was in fact a duty for both spouses. The church taught that a husband or wife who refused their spouse's legitimate sexual requests was committing a sin of denial. The blessing of the bed was simply the church placing its sanction on a sacred obligation. What the blessing also represented, more subtly, was the church's assertion of authority over the most private acts of human life. The medieval church did not recognize a boundary between the sacred and the domestic. The bedroom was a space where God's law operated just as surely as the cathedral. The priest's presence at the bedding ceremony was a reminder of that fact. Even in the most intimate moment of a person's life, the institution was watching. What the bride experienced to speak honestly about the medieval wedding night requires speaking honestly about who bore the greatest burden of it. And that was, in almost every case, the bride. She may have been very young. She was almost certainly marrying a man she had not chosen and possibly had met only recently. She had spent the day in public ritual, the evening in a feast that centered her body as a subject of explicit public humor, and she had just been undressed by a room full of people and placed in a bed. Whatever she felt, fear, confusion, resignation, or in rarer cases, genuine anticipation, she had no sanctioned language in which to express reluctance. Medieval medical literature, which was almost entirely written by men, devoted considerable attention to the wedding night from the groom's perspective. It advised patience with a very young bride. It suggested the groom speak gently, use careful preparation, and not rush. Some of this advice was genuinely motivated by concern for the bride's well-being. Much of it was motivated by the practical concern that a traumatized or injured bride would be less capable of fulfilling her reproductive function going forward. What medieval literature did not do was consider the bride's experience as valuable in itself. Her comfort mattered instrumentally. A calm bride was more likely to conceive, more likely to remain functional as a wife and mother. But it did not matter intrinsically. There is no medieval equivalent of a conversation about a young woman's readiness, her desires, her fears. The literature is simply not interested in those questions. She was present, and she was willing by definition of being present, and that was the entirety of the framework. For older brides, women marrying in their late teens or 20s, which was more common among peasant classes, the situation could be somewhat different. A woman with more life experience, perhaps a widow remarrying, had a clearer sense of what the night entailed and occasionally more social standing to influence its terms. But even here, the fundamental power dynamic did not change. Her body remained the object of the transaction, and the wedding night remained the moment that transaction was finalized. The morning after, when morning came, the married life officially began. In many communities, the morning after the wedding carried its own rituals. The bride might be formally received by her new household in her role as its mistress. Gifts might be exchanged. In some traditions, the groom presented his new wife with a gift on the morning after consummation, a practice sometimes called the morning gift, or in Germanic tradition, the Morgengabe. This gift, which could be land, jewelry, money, or goods, was understood as payment for the bride's virginity or as compensation for the ordeal of the wedding night, depending on how one reads the custom. The morning gift is one of the more telling details in the entire ritual. It acknowledges, almost inadvertently, that the wedding night had been something the bride had given or endured rather than chosen. The groom's gift the following morning was a recognition that something had been taken and that it carried value and that a transaction had occurred. In its own way, it is an admission buried in custom of exactly what the wedding night had really been. The medieval wedding night was a ceremony, a legal act, a public spectacle, a religious ritual, and an intimate human experience all at once. For the guests, it was entertainment and celebration. For the church, it was the sacred sealing of a sacrament. For the groom, it was the completion of a contract and the beginning of a household. For the bride, it was all of those things. That is the truth about the medieval wedding night, not candlelight and romance. A ritual of power, dressed in the language of love.